Hello, and welcome to In Pursuit of Clarity, episode number 41, entitled Breaking the Spell. You may have noticed I've been using the word magic more often lately, especially in referencing the means and methods of the master deceivers behind the scenes, and in the recent discussion of the Magi in the Secret History video. We tend to have a strangely narrow and superficial understanding of this word in our age. When most people think of magic, it conjures up images of card tricks, or sleight of hand, or similar illusions. But this is to magic what a modern pop song might be to a Wagnerian opera or a Beethoven symphony. It technically falls under the same label or definition, but it's such a cheap and bastardized version and manifestation of the core concept that in actuality there's almost no relation between the two. They're worlds apart. And it's important to truly understand this idea because we live in a world dominated by master magicians. Deception and illusions are their trade and their weapons. The fostering and cultivation of delusion and confusion in their enthralled audience is the goal. Yet, at the same time, ensuring this audience never catches wind of just how the trick is done, which would, of course, cause it to lose all of its power. I believe these master magicians are a result and outgrowth of a culture, a product of generations of very different thinking and living, different perspectives and worldviews than the average man on the street. I've spoken in the past about how deeply culture shapes us, even down to the level of genetic expression. For example, a martial nation, perhaps surrounded by foes and completely devoted to the art of self-defense and physical warfare, might not only start to produce slightly larger or stronger men due to its warrior elite being more highly prized in terms of mate selection, but nearly every aspect of how they see themselves and the world around them would also shift accordingly, ideally allowing them to slowly but surely lay the foundation to master the art of war. Similarly, if a subset of sages or holy men were to break off from a larger population, as in the case of the Essenes, for example, after generations of self-discipline and an environment in which men sought to walk with God and be virtuous and just, a child born into this world would develop a completely unique mindset accordingly. These things get passed down to a large extent, even if the original tradition fades and subsequent generations no longer see any pressing need to uphold the doctrine, ideology, or general belief structure of their fathers. Because parents can't help but shape their children in a manner similar to which they were shaped, even if the specifics of these ideas are never discussed between parent to child. The overall orientation of the parent can be intuitively sensed, and is to some degree subconsciously pieced together by the child, whose brain is essentially a sponge, desperately seeking all of the information it can find in order to make its way in the world. And to continue using our example of a martial society, a child from a long line of military pilots might unconsciously learn to especially prize or respect courage or adventurousness. Or a child from a long line of military generals might equally prize strategy and planning as positive attributes. A child from a long line of patriarchs might see his people as his flock in the recesses of his brain, and accordingly go on to prize judgment and temperance, knowledge and understanding in order to play some part in helping them, whereas a child from a line of charlatans and televangelists may learn to value oratory, superficial charisma, and perhaps have seeds planted in him that maybe life really is just a rat race in which we all lie to one another, and the best liars are then rewarded with the most comfortable lives, and go on to determine that the best path for him is to learn to lie effectively and with a straight face. And not to digress too far from the point I'm seeking to make, but I spoke of the particular expression of our genes being heavily influenced by the culture in which our ancestors lived. A fascinating example of this concept, still poorly understood by science, is in the studies of twins separated at birth and adopted into different households, growing up apart and never knowing one another. studies which are frequently brought up and discussed in the ongoing nature versus nurture debates which rage to this day. One would expect these twins to physically develop in a similar manner, of course, and perhaps even have similar IQ. But what was so incredible in the lives of the twins in these studies, who were often set down polar opposite paths with regard to the different environments in which they grew up, was how similar their personality and psychological wiring ended up being, despite this. Very often, they'd have similar occupations, similar tastes across the board, in some cases, an uncanny, almost unbelievable mirror image. This, coupled with the understanding of epigenetics we're just now beginning to formulate, suggests that both nature and nurture are incredibly powerful shaping forces, and also that they're often so deeply intertwined that it's difficult to sort out or isolate the effects of one or the other. Our nurture shapes our nature shapes our nurture, in an endless cycle. This means that even if the nurture chain is broken, by adoption for example, this child who never knew his biological parents or siblings is still likely to carry with him not just similar physical characteristics, but some psychological and perhaps even spiritual characteristics and personality traits. So, if we accept that a child is the end product, and in some case the archetypal representation of all who came before him, and that certain traits or tendencies or manners of thinking and being can be maximized or refined and improved, and others might equally be minimized, degraded, or practically eliminated, I'd like us to engage in a thought experiment on this basis. Let's pretend for a moment at some point in history one of the innumerable various conspiracies for total power across the stretch of recorded history actually succeeded, and a certain group of people were able to monopolize sufficient levers of power and organs of influence to promote those willing to play their game and be compliant, demote or destroy those who weren't, and finally able to use this power to cover their tracks, to the extent that most looking on might believe, or perhaps be scared enough to allow themselves to embrace the delusion, that there was no singular power behind the scenes, but instead just a naturally occurring variety of warring and contending forces, representing every type of idea or philosophy or human being, all of whom somehow just never quite managed to get a leg up on one another. Like the Phoenicians or Venetians or Druids or Magi, this singular force would certainly have to be international in scope and spread, meaning to truly ensure continuation of power, it'd have to be immune to the threat of being toppled with the death or sudden regime change within any one given nation. It would have to have a consistent source of wealth, perhaps via the domination of trade routes or the major merchants and institutions involved, especially at bottlenecks. And let's use the British East India Company as a hypothetical modern example here. And it would need to cultivate and maintain high-level relationships throughout the world with kings, monarchs, prime ministers, or politicians of every stripe, with those most responsible for operating the printing press in previous eras, or television and print and online media in our age. It would need to have a powerful and compelling assortment of carrots and sticks to both incentivize and punish all of these influential individuals. But more than anything, it would need to foster a culture amongst its own people and inner circle, one that allowed them to see the world in a unique way and essentially speak a unique language, an international language, a managerial language, a language of money, manipulation, masks and subterfuge, and court intrigue, a language wholly devoted to power acquisition and maintenance, a language that all but ensured their continued dominance, a language of which fluency allowed one to operate at higher levels of material power and see the broader picture, while the rest of the public played much smaller games for much smaller prizes. Assuming such a conspiracy succeeded, what we'd see all around us are individuals in positions of immense power who don't seem to deserve the role, who don't seem to especially care for their people or nation or culture, except when pretending to do so might boost public opinion of themselves or otherwise assist in their winning elections or staving off revolts or revolutions. We'd see a general trend towards chaos and disorder, an artificially tilted playing field which massively benefits some as much as it hinders others, a popular culture seemingly devoted to creating an unthinking, malleable, unquestioning mass, devoted to bread and circuses, and doing whatever it takes to earn the equivalent of table scraps, chasing pieces of paper that this hypothetical culture might also monopolize the ability to print freely, and then find ways to directly distribute to allied corporations and institutions. With regard to individual nations, we'd see a series of rises and falls, booms and busts, yet with certain families always ending up on top, no matter how seemingly chaotically the snow globe is shaken. Again, not because they're exceptional people, possessing exceptional skill sets, or somehow creating exceptional value for those around them, but rather mysteriously, as if by magic. However, at the same time, we'd also likely see a gradual degradation in their methods and self-discipline, a gradual diminishment of their ability to master the arts of their forebears, a creeping laziness. After all, when you have absolutely any and every material desire you could ever dream of, from birth in many cases, when the public is essentially your unwitting slave force to be guided to and fro accordingly, it would naturally be difficult to maintain that sharp edge. A loose analogy might be the case of first-generation immigrants tending to be relatively hardworking and law-abiding, and yet second, third, or fourth very often take it all for granted and often become the opposite. This lax discipline might allow elements of the public to catch sight of red flags, or brief glimpses of what exists behind the curtain, to start asking uncomfortable questions and demanding uncomfortable answers. And because all the major facets of this international machine would of course be intimately connected, when these especially curious and inquisitive and skeptical members of the public begin to dig into one arena, they may find connections to another, which then connects to another and another, gradually putting the pieces together, threatening to unveil and unmask the true structure and its foremost operators. Historically speaking, there do seem to be ways to wipe the memory of the public in such emergency cases, to engage in aggressive misdirection as power brokers scurry back into the shadows. Major wars have acted in part as the most powerful of these, especially because the victors write the history books, and traditionally the forces of money have always been the true victors. But when a sufficient number of people begin to understand enough about just how the machine operates, enough about the men and forces most responsible for its operation, and especially when these people become familiar with these tactics of misdirection and amnesia-producing contingency plans, it may eventually become impossible to contain them. I do think we have the equivalent of dark magicians running the show at present, and I wanted to speak to my own conception of how to best break their spell. For so many of us, modern life has become like some episode of The Twilight Zone. Each day, we wake up to headlines, at least all over the legacy media, which thankfully seems to be dying, that are so absurdly and brazenly false or misleading that it almost seems unbelievable. Yet it's not just the lies, but it's the specific choices of framing and focus, meaning the stories they choose to view as stories, the happenings they pretend are the most worthy of attention. In short, everything about the material they churn out on a daily basis intuitively feels unhealthy, unnatural, cheap or petty, or simply exhausting. To give one random example of a subjective framing of reality they push so aggressively, they measure the success of individuals or nations based on economic metrics, or their earnings, or their, quote, economic well-being, while our spiritual and psychological well-being is ignored almost completely, and while the idea of having children is discouraged and raising a family is denigrated, if mentioned at all. The books or movies or online content they push us toward, seems tailor-made to tear down timeless conceptions of how to best think and live and be, and to create ever more artificial constructs in their place. And I could go on for hours, but I've said much of this in the past, and I think most of you listening already know and understand just how poisonous this influence is. One of the best ways to describe it, to hopefully simplify and clarify, is that they've found the most efficient and effective way to minister to our addictions, while simultaneously encouraging ever more base and unhealthy addictions, inflaming desires, teaching people the fulfillment of these desires is the path to happiness, and then teaching people the only way to fulfill these desires is to join the current rat race as is, but also, just as importantly, to both believe and give voice to the proper political and ideological viewpoints as you do so. Increasingly, modern life is the equivalent of walking down a cold concrete street, surrounded by flashing neon lights all around us, each making promises it can't begin to keep in exchange for the products of our labor, time, and energy. And as time passes, the street seems to get ever colder, the flashing advertisements ever more numerous, flashing ever more brightly and with greater frequency, with those walking down it feeling ever more disappointment after giving in to the temptation, each time experiencing diminishing returns as a result. And I like this example because it's so directly analogous to the larger struggle we all face. The secret to breaking the spell boils down to this: being able to recognize consciously and definitively, and store it into memory, that ministering to these superficial addictions doesn't bring happiness, and that the constant quest to do so is literally a waste of life and a drain on spirit. Before I'd even discovered the Ora Linda book, I had a quote written down on the very first pages of a large book of quotes and snippets that I'd later fill completely over the coming years, attributed to Freya or Freya. Quote, "Salvation awaits the free. At last they shall see me again. Though him alone may I recognize as free, who is no slave of another, nor his own impulses." End quote. And this is a sentiment that can just as easily be found across nearly every major spiritual or wisdom tradition. Christ himself in the desert faces and must overcome the highest of all temptation. And there's a very similar story about Gautama Buddha. Temptations have always existed and have always served to distract and lead men astray in moments of weakness. But never, in the entire span of recorded history, have temptations been so powerful. They're now fashioned with algorithmic and scientific precision, personalized, customized, and tailored to each individual, and will be ever more so in the future. Addictions are thus inevitably being created at a record pace, and it's no surprise as to why they increasingly lure us in, because all addictions act as a form of escapism, and so many of us have every reason to try to escape this crumbling world, and find at least temporary respite somewhere. As our world grows ever uglier, ever more disordered and unnatural, there will be an ever more powerful draw here in equal measure. We sometimes think of our generation having things vastly easier than those of much earlier eras, and in some narrow senses, this is obviously accurate. But pulling out to the broadest perspective, I'm not so sure we do have it easier. They lived more natural lives in every sense, and reaped the rewards of so doing. What we traditionally think of as hardship isn't quite so hard when a person knows they're doing what they should be, and has a relatively healthy orientation, firm footing, and some degree of confidence in their way of life or manner of thinking. But perhaps most importantly, these generations from the distant past weren't surrounded by a never-ending succession of temptation toward vices of every imaginable type, and almost without exception certainly weren't living in an environment in which indulging in all of these vices was normalized, let alone cheered and encouraged. We face unique struggles in this respect, and they're absolutely nothing to be laughed at or dismissed. In many ways, the admirable self-discipline I see in those who came before us was easier to maintain, for the reasons just mentioned, but also because when those around you have higher standards, it's easier to have them yourself, and see the reason to have them. An attribute which might be viewed as the hallmark of a healthier society, because life simply shouldn't be a never-ending minefield of life-draining pitfalls and dead ends. So, how can a person hope to steel themselves against this ceaseless barrage of temptations? For starters, I don't think the problem should be framed as simply trying to avoid the negative, meaning keeping in mind all of the bad things that might result. The immense positives that spring from walking the narrower path are a far better and more compelling focus. The concept of inward riches is another lofty bit of wisdom that permeates all of our various traditions, and couldn't be more important to keep ever present in mind here. Any number of disasters could strike, and all of the external riches a person has worked the bulk of their waking hours for and toward could go up in smoke in a flash. But consider those types of riches and inward wealth that can never be taken away for as long as you live, and in some cases, perhaps well beyond. Physical health, physical development, and fitness, keeping the mental faculties in an optimal state, is a decent example here, and vastly more worthwhile than material possessions. But even these will eventually fade to varying degrees. So this is just a peripheral example. Seeking to truly understand yourself and your world, and working to craft a healthy guiding philosophy and worldview accordingly, is an even better example, and one that can keep a person centered, sane, and happy well into old age. Seeking to understand your Creator, the perfect balance and harmony of His creation, and your own personal role within it, is still more powerful and lasting. Cultivating such inward riches has the power to make the lows more tolerable, the highs more fulfilling, and helps one plant their feet. It fosters solidity and confidence, and helps one better understand and emulate the example of the unmoved mover. Growing up, as I read Plato or Socrates or Plotinus or Kierkegaard or Nietzsche, I'd hear many of these great thinkers, and similar minds, speak of deep knowledge and understanding as something that had the power to bring with it profound and unshakable contentment, even happiness or ecstasy at times. Yes, it's true that pure intellect can sometimes usher in melancholy or depression, but wisdom always does the reverse, and I appreciated this lesson from these most capable minds. For a long while, I wondered whether or not this might be, as the kids say, cope, meaning maybe these were older men having lost much of their youthful health and vigor and vitality, merely putting on a brave face and finding ways to content themselves with what they had left in life. I now know this isn't the case. Far, far from it. We often say knowledge is power, or information is power, and we often equate an increase in power to an increase in happiness or contentment, but we rarely seem to make both of these conclusions at once and trace this direct connection. The more one truly and deeply understands the world in which they live, the less fear and trepidation they feel at every turn in life, the more deeply confident and content they're able to be as a result. Even Jesus commanded his followers to be wise as serpents, advice that so many Christians seem to have casually disregarded as of late. Fear, stress, and anxiety almost exclusively arise from a root of misunderstanding, misapprehension, and the resulting feeling of insecurity, broadly speaking. And fear is an immensely powerful tool, not merely for those who seek control and personal power in this world, because those who feel fear immediately clamor to implement a solution, and these trained and practiced deceivers almost always seem to have a ready-made solution on hand that so perfectly suits their larger aims, but also because fear completely changes us. changes the way we think and approach the world and approach one another. It really does lower our frequency, for lack of a better term, and makes it impossible to recognize or resonate with higher realms. Being in a state of fear means the reptile brain takes the helm, and we shift into a purely utilitarian mindset. This state of mind, which in prior ages helped us defend ourselves or our loved ones against very real threats, be they snakes or beasts or bandits or aggressive and warlike neighbors, is now brutally taken advantage of by this culture of dark magicians, who seem to want to keep the population in this state indefinitely. Finding the path to conquer this fear without becoming numb or purposeless and unmotivated is one of the foremost keys to life and to accruing these inward riches, or even being able to recognize them for what they are in the first place. It sounds too simple, even dismissive, but nearly every last thing we feel such great fear about, or stress or anxiety with regard to, when we actually sit down and contemplate the worst case scenario in the long run and from a broader perspective, ends up being a paper tiger, absolutely not worth the time and energy in fretting over. Or, to phrase this differently, when the dust settles, things never end up being as bad as they seemed like they might be, which means nearly all of our suffering in this respect is self-created, unnecessary, and self-delusion. We seem to be great at spotting any type of self-delusion that paints life in overly rosy or optimistic hues, but for some reason we're terrible at recognizing the mass of delusions we freely harbor that have the opposite effect and serve to drag us down or create our own hell. And these are a far more common sort of delusion. A leading source of these fears and anxieties and delusions, paradoxically, is freedom, a concept as important as it is misunderstood in our age of muddied language and degraded communication, and one I'd like to devote an entire cast to unpacking in the future. Freedom seems to be an absolute necessity for our salvation, yet it might just as easily be said that freedom is killing us. It's the epitome of a double-edged sword. All people should have the freedom to think and speak as they please, and freedom to avoid being forcibly compelled to walk paths they disagree with. But our age, while it cracks down on this most positive type of freedom, is simultaneously fostering and aggressively pushing and advertising an extremely negative type of freedom, especially in the sphere of ideas and beliefs. Picture you're attempting to write a story sitting in front of a blank sheet of paper. There are endless possibilities, 360 degrees of freedom in every direction. Until you're able at least to determine a theme or a starting point or the first few words, this freedom can feel daunting, overwhelming. Though when you finally do hit upon a good idea, one that resonates, the words might then begin to flow naturally, and ideally the story can begin to take on a character that feels right. Because you've taken the first step and created some bounds, some structure and framework, making it vastly easier to then proceed to create within and according to those bounds. Nature and the hand of our Creator might be seen as our natural bounds, our guidelines, a precious few elements of distinct clarity, allowing the creative process to flourish and build upon this base. The modern world, especially the subversive class who call themselves intellectuals at present, are creating a state of being in which we are always presented with a blank page. The hard-won and time-tested and well-proven wisdom of those who came before us, or even the most simple and obvious truths that nature bestows, such as the biological realities of gender, or the natural order and hierarchy pervading all of the natural world, are being tossed aside. As is the idea of a traditional family, or the idea that communities and nations might operate best when they resemble an actual family. All of these most simple and obvious truths that any man living more than a few decades ago would have considered plainly obvious are now under full-scale attack. There's a reason why all recent data shows over 50% of those on the political left have some form of mental disorder. And it's not merely because the ideology attracts the disordered, like moths to a flame. It creates them. Donald Kingsbury put it well in saying, quote, "Tradition is a set of solutions for which we have forgotten the problems. Throw away the solution and you get the problem back." End quote. And I've mentioned this concept before, but it bears repeating. It's very much as if all who came before us handed down a short book of best practices, a result of generations and millennia of trial and error and prudent judgments. And many in our age have chosen to simply toss this book in the fire, perhaps even maligning it and their predecessors who contributed to it as they do so. Part of this spell cast over the world in recent decades has been aimed at inspiring an enthusiastic hatred for those who worked so hard to create the world we're currently burning to the ground. Few sayings resonate more with me as of late than the simple request that we can know or judge a person based on their fruits, and this applies just as cleanly to any new idea or ideology. If practicing a set of ideas or embracing a manner of thinking makes a person more angry, more depressed, more disordered and imbalanced mentally or spiritually, less physically fit, healthy, or beautiful, this is the clearest possible testament against the idea. All the mental gymnastics and attempted justifications and clever arguments in the world should fall on deaf ears in the face of this clearest and most direct of testaments. It takes incredibly strong magic to incrementally walk the public into such lost, confused territory. The problem, of course, is that the average person is absolutely surrounded by these dark arts. Television and movies have become concentrated poison, incrementally enough to where those still immersed in that world haven't quite noticed that even the vast majority of commercials they see, which used to be used to sell products and make money, are now aggressively pushing political and social agendas. And this segues nicely into the final point. I spoke about the constant undercurrent of fear, so artfully stoked and pushed on the public with consistency, especially by legacy television media. There's a similar undercurrent of anger, hopelessness, and despondency. Of these, anger is unique in that it can be a productive emotion. If there's neither too little or too much, and it can be harnessed as a driving and motivating force. Despondency and hopelessness, however, are completely worthless. And as I've mentioned in the past, they really aren't justified. There's no sense anymore looking at present societal trends and pretending they'll just continue in the same direction and at the same pace. It's obvious now to nearly all on both sides of the fence at this stage. Things are certainly coming to a head one way or another. The best we can do is to turn off and phase out as much of the propaganda and the depressing or unhelpful noise of modern life. And I mean this. Consider making the decision right now to simply devote less time to anything and everything that has a negative effect on you. And in the meantime, we can start making moves and connections to create parallel structures on all fronts. I'd like you to imagine for a moment what big cities would look like in 5 to 10 years if completely handed over to our enemies. Seriously, imagine it if you can. The mass robberies and huge spikes in murder happening all across the nation aren't even a taste of what might come in these scenarios. I don't wish this hell on anyone, but the best, and perhaps at this point the only, way to wake them out of their indoctrinated stupor is to let them fully experience the fruits of their ideology. They truly are enthralled by this dark magic. The only hope for most of them at this point is the incredibly jarring wake-up call of societal collapse at free-fall speed. And yes, even this will somehow be blamed on white Christians or Trump voters or racists or nationalists. But even some of the most daft and oblivious will start to connect the dots when their convenience and ease of life begins to fade. It's been said that, quote, a harmless man is not a good man. A good man is a very, very dangerous man who has it under voluntary control. This is certainly true. And as difficult as the control part might be about now, this is the mindset we need to recognize and embrace. I know we're all in different positions and situations, which is why I'd so love to see some of the parallel institutions that spring up in coming weeks and months and years to devote themselves exclusively toward aiding or protecting those desperately in need. But for those with the money or knowledge or courage or resources, consider quietly finding ways to be very dangerous very quickly should the need arise. And I'll end with this, echoing a sentiment I can't possibly stress enough. One of the things I've always so loved about our people is their ability to not just persevere, but often even find ways to thrive in the darkest hours. I remember seeing traces of a unique sort of dark or gallows humor in my own family, and recognizing just how valuable this is, how valuable it must have been during the ultimate lows of the past. We are a people that, when given freezing cold temperatures and frozen lakes and rivers in winter, broke out the ice skates, had snowball fights, and made snowmen. There's no greater art to life than learning to banish the pessimistic melancholy and foreboding hopelessness, and finding ways to take the best that fate has to throw at you and laugh in its face. Again, easier said than done, but we have done it and can do it. And any move toward such a life philosophy is a step in the right direction. A fight is coming. Losing heart and hope just before it breaks out in earnest is not an option. There's a great number of positive things happening not just in the US, but all over the world. And yet, even if this weren't the case, even if there were virtually no positive happenings and the horizon was devoid of any encouraging signs, which is never the case, of course, but we'll just use this as a hypothetical, there's still nothing to be gained from having an adversarial relationship with the world as a whole, or with the entirety of our reality and material existence. As the saying goes, this is the only game in town. Whether we like it or not, we are thrust into this environment and have to choose how to interpret and navigate it. And there's no more surefire path to paralyzing unhappiness and discontent, or a lowered state of mind and consciousness, than refusing to recognize and maintain a focus on the brighter spots in life. The goal is to move toward this light and away from the darkness. Darkness which can overwhelm if one chooses to dwell on it, which is ultimately no different than choosing to dwell in it. And I'll never stop repeating this. It really is a choice. Right this second, as you listen to these words, there are countless numbers of wholly good and healthy and white-pilling and life-affirming things going on, just as there are countless numbers of the opposite happening all around us. We choose which of these to look at, to allow into our consciousness, and to become part of our reality. We only need to focus on the disease long enough to get some real idea of how to treat it, or separate ourselves from it, and not a second more. Any further exposure is equivalent to attaching anchors or weights to our spirit, and is completely unnecessary and unhelpful. Apologies if I sound like a broken record on this topic, but it's a conscious choice to repeat this as often as I do. Things are likely to get much, much worse for a brief period before they get better. And it's the well-wired and well-oriented people who will feel the effects of this most profoundly. It drains and exhausts because it was designed to. And insofar as it accomplishes this, it's a win for those engaging in this attempted cultural and spiritual coup. I hope you might find solace and assurance in the fact that the extreme successes of this subversive push happened because a war was being waged in which only one side was cognizant of the fact that there was a war, capturing an immense amount of ground and territory, while the other side essentially slept, naively and obliviously. But when this side finally finds its footing, recognizes exactly how and where the battle lines are drawn, and the sleeping giant awakes accordingly, the sickly little dark magicians behind the curtain don't stand a chance. I hope you all had a Merry Christmas, a Happy Yule, and that you're able to recognize genuine reasons to be hopeful in the coming year. I appreciate you and sincerely hope you're well. And that's all for now. Thanks for listening.
This is the end, beautiful friend. This is the end, my only